Before I start, I want to point out that this is hot off the press, and we've got a stack of them up here. And so please be sure to get one of these. It talks about the exhibit and all the programming that Crooked Tree has put together for this amazing summer with our Ansel Adams exhibit, and then the exhibit of the photography exhibit of the national parks. And then also in the front, Heidi Marshall has a painting, small painting exhibit. Those pieces are up. They're beautiful. They're beautiful. So please be sure to pick up your copy. And if we've already run out, I know they have more. Okay? Good. So thank you for coming. And as you know, this is the third of the lectures, the docent lectures for our upcoming exhibit about Ansel Adams. And the focus of this talk, Reverence of the Land, I'm going to be talking about the inspirations, the intentions, and kind of the technique that goes on, the technique that goes on within the artist's creative process, and then also the cultural narratives. What is the philosophy, the psychology that's going on within the culture that impacts us as an audience, and then also impacts the artist, impacts Ansel Adams. Okay, so it's how do we view his work, how do we receive his work, and then how did that impact his making? I've got two objectives that I'm going to try to cover today. One is that lens of the artist. So I'm going to be talking about artist inspiration, and specifically with the focus on reverence of the land. Then also looking at that through Ansel Adams' work. And then, you know, when I was asked to do this, well, actually I kind of volunteered. Why do Ansel Adams' photographs speak to such a broad audience? Why do they still resonate today? Ansel Adams is a household name. I think he's the only photographer that is a household name. So that just, the cultural mythologist in me just went, I want to try to unpack that and figure that out. So I'm doing that through looking at these cultural narratives, okay? Now, something you need to know about me. One, I'm an introvert. Okay, so I've been teaching for a while, and I've gotten better about that. But what that means is that I can kind of go down the rabbit hole, so I have notes. That's how we navigate that territory, or I've learned to navigate that territory. The second thing that I want you all to know, this has in the front of it a lovely kind of very short bio about Ansel Adams. And that type of readily available information, I'm not covering today, all right? It's available online, it's available here. I'm looking at things that are less available. So the things that I'm talking about are greatly influenced by my bias, right? One, I'm an artist. And so I have a 40-year creative practice. And so I am going to be talking about what it's like inside that artist's life. We're going to be looking at how we work with inspirations, intentions, our beliefs. And then also, as importantly, is techne, or technique. And a lot of times, certainly in a vast amount of contemporary work, technique is really not looked at or maybe viewed as secondary. And I really believe in technique, and I think it's essential with the work of Ansel Adams, and so we are going to be addressing that issue. The other thing that you already know is that I'm a cultural mythologist. And so what that means is I look at cultural stories, narratives, the myths, that both historic and present, and how that influences not only the way the culture believes, their systems of belief, but how it impacts the individual and the work that they make. And then also how we then perceive that work. These narratives impact us. So it's that inner outer. So we're going to be looking at the inside first from the artist, and then the outside, this more cultural view. I'm going to be taking questions at the end, but if you have a pressing question in the moment, go for it. Okay? All right. So one of the things that I always start out with is this concept of illumination. And so I hope that our discussion today illuminates our understanding of the artist's inspiration, but Ansel Adams' work in particular. So when we look at the word illumination, that's light. It's shedding light on something. And so when we do that, that implies that there's darkness, that there's shadow, right? So implicit in illumination is shadow. So that interplay is what we're going to be looking at, both metaphorically and figuratively in our discussion. There's a saying, without darkness, there are no stars. I love that. And so that concept, we're going to be, just let that linger. Okay. Page 2. Uh-oh, I'm already behind. I wanted to start, you were supposed to be looking at something fun. So when I said illumination, when I talked about bringing light and dealing with the shadows, it's one of the fabulous aspects of Ansel Adams' work. So I think when you see that, you're going to be seeing this interplay of light and shadow. He was a master of it. Okay. We're going to start on the inside. Uh-oh. Well, it may be for you. Oops. That's good. That's good. Can you all still see this? Yeah. Okay, good.
Would you like this instead?
I think this is better. For me, this is better if it's okay with you all. Okay. So let's look at the inside of the artist's perspective. And I want to think about that word inspiration. Inspiration comes from inspire, which means to blow, to breathe into. So you can imagine that the artist breathes life into their creation, right? They're making this idea, this image that they have, and they're inspired to bring life to it. Ansel Adams was inspired to bring life to these images that he had and make them manifest. So an artist has their inspiration, they have their intention, and it's profoundly influenced by their deep emotions and their beliefs. What matters most? What touches them most to their heart? So for generations, we know that was, so much art was religious. And we have artwork that gives voice to the divine. We have artwork that gives voice to nature and ecological issues. We have artwork that gives voice to feminism. So all these different beliefs, things that artists feel strongly about, we're going to see translated into image, right? And so, so our focus today, that inspiration that we're looking at, is this notion of this reverence of the land, okay? And I'm going to be looking at several artists, but we're going to focus on the work of Ansel Adams. Now I want to talk then a moment about techne, or technique. So when artists goes through, they have to make a decision about what process they're going to use, what medium they're going to use. How are they going to give voice to what they feel so strongly about? So one of the things that we know is that AT&T. So we know from John's previous lectures, so I'm going to refer a few times to John's previous lectures. If you haven't seen them, you can. They're online. You can get more in-depth information about that. But John referenced this term visualization that Ansel Adams used with his process. So in his mind's eye, Adams, he used this term visualization. He saw in his mind's eye what he wanted the image to look like. Well, most artists more or less share in that, okay? So the goal of the artist is, one of the things that we try to do, how do we give voice to, and make manifest, to make an object that matches what we have in our imagination, that matches what we have in our mind's eye, what Ansel Adams called visualization. So Ansel Adams knew what he wanted it to look like. He knew he wanted a full tonal range. He knew those darks mattered. They really mattered to him. So he created a system, the zone system. It's used today. John could talk to you forever about the zone system. He used to teach it. I can't. So it impacts his work because he was able to control both the negative and the print. So we are experiencing images that really are greatly influenced by his need to make what's in here and what's out here match. Does that make sense? So he's also famous for well, he co-founded it, this system, this zone system. You know, one of the things that I get a lot as an artist, the biggest thing is, oh, aren't you so lucky? That's so fun. And what it is, the word fun rarely resonates with me, but it is so profoundly satisfying. And, when you're in your studio, well, some people are like, woo! But when you have those happy accidents, the intention is that you can replicate it, right? That you can, again and again, be able to make that same kind of product or technique. This is what Adams has been able to do with his work. Okay. Oh, I'm just moving right along. Do we see with this the importance of his controlling of the light? So when he took this picture, we have this very important light here. We have very important light here and here, right? So it's moving our eye around, but we have this depth, we have this mystery going on. So he didn't bring it all up so it's all in the middle gray tones. He has this dark and light movement. It moves our eye, but it also brings us into the image. So, reverence of the land. Let's look for a minute at this word reverence. And it comes from a Latin word that, so I'm going to have a hard time saying this one, but it's reverere, which is to stand in awe of. It's something that we hold in value, that we hold in esteem, and we usually think of reverence as being up, right? So from reverence, we also have reverie. Reverie. Reverie is to contemplate, to reflect. And then from that, we have the French rêver, which is to dream, which is to wander. So we have daydream. Do we see this? So with reverence, there's awe, there's respect, coupled with that undernote of contemplation, dreaming, and recalling. Does that make sense? So let's look at some other artists that I believe share in this inspiration of reverence of the land. Georgia O'Keeffe. So we all know Georgia O'Keeffe's work, and one of the things that she did, she was in love, as Ansel Adams was profoundly in love with Yosemite and with nature. Georgia was profoundly in love with the American Southwest, and New Mexico in particular. And she painted it over and over and over again, just like Adams photographed Yosemite over and over and over again. So this landscape was what she saw right outside of her ranch, Ghost Ranch, and she painted it over and over and over again. There's a quote from Georgia that says, "It's my private mountain. It belongs to me. God told me if I painted it enough, I could have it." So, the brief description of this talk today was that I was going to talk about landscapes both real and imagined. So we really move into, and it's neither one nor the other. There's movement, even in Adams' work, right, of real and imagined. And so we can clearly understand that concept with Georgia O'Keeffe's work and how she's referencing the land. You can feel her love and giving voice to it. And one of the things that Georgia did is that she found things that were all around her and she elevated them. And here she's literally elevating it, right? Something we hold in esteem, we elevate. So we know she loved the skulls that she found and the hollyhock. And her work is unique in that she juxtaposed these odd things, showing her reverence. Again, on high. Now this black place was a name that Georgia O'Keeffe gave to one of her favorite sites in New Mexico. And she painted it over and over and over again. But one of the things that I want to pay attention to is also how we can move into the details. We see some of that with Adams' work. He doesn't get in quite as far, but we have these grand landscapes, but then we also have where we move in. You all know when you're walking through the woods or you're hiking or you're just out, there's the grand view, and then when you pause and take time and look down, it's the microcosm, macrocosm. We've got a whole world here. And this is what I feel with her work with this type, that she's going into the minute. God is in the details. And then a later piece, very imaginal, right? Emily Carr. Do we know Emily? Yes. Emily's a Canadian. And there was part of me that really wrestled with bringing in a Canadian because I'm talking so much about the American West, but she's in the west part of Canada, or was. So Emily Carr felt, she studied with the Fauves in France, and when she came back, she really had a profound dislike for institutionalized religion and the institutions of religion. She had a profound religious experience of being in nature. And so that's what she said she wanted to do, to share that mystical experience of being in nature. And so we see that in her choice of color and the movement. Who do we sense in this image? Don't we? Yeah. Imaginary, but also real. So it's trying to give voice to her inner image, her experience. Adams talked about that. He talked about, well, I want my work to be more than just about the external event, just witnessing the environment, just witnessing these grand sights. I want it to be about, also to be about that internal event. What goes on within us? How do we perceive? How is it impacting us? So we know that it's impacting these artists, but it's also impacting us as viewers, right? So it's that inner story. It's the feeling tone, okay? I've only got one image of Minor White, but Minor White is a very important photographer, and the body of work called Equivalence, but he was influenced by Eastern philosophy, by meditation, and he intentionally wanted to show the spiritual aspect of nature. And this image, he shot with infrared film. It's a light spectrum that we can't see, but it's as if, you know, there's this otherworldliness that's going on. This is what happens when we see this. We recognize it as a landscape, but yet it shifts our engagement with us. We're like, well, wow, trees really glowing like that? So again, it's the inner-outer relationship, but it's our psychological perception and emotional response to it. Okay, Edward Weston. Do we know him? Yes. We should all know him. He was an amazing photographer. He was also part of the F-64 group that Adams was in, right? So if we remember the F-64 group, the F-64 talks about the aperture, so it's the smallest aperture. What does that do? That gives us the greatest depth of field, so we have very sharp images, okay? And also this tonal quality, but it's the clarity. We have full depth in the clarity. So Weston's passion was California. Well, it was also the American West, but he was profoundly in love. He lived in California, and so he wanted to give voice to that. And one of the things that I love about his work is his attention and his sensitivity to the rhythms of nature. So it's real, but it's also imagined. Do we sense that? Yeah. And do you feel the reverence? Oh boy, I'm just way ahead of myself. Let me see. Whew. I think I'm up to, guess what? Get ready, here she comes. Okay. This is why I wanted to do the talk, because I share deeply in the inspiration of Reverence of the Land. So a few of you may remember that I had an exhibit here back in 11 called Memory Boats, Dreams and Reflections that dealt very specifically with this reverence of the land. And I've talked about symbol and metaphor just a little, but this work was about honoring and celebrating the bounty of the earth. And then the things on the ground, those are the cultural shadow. Moving toward this concept of an I-thou relationship with nature as opposed to an I-it. If we think of nature as a thou, we will take care of it. If we think of it as an it, it's a debasing. So I'm also a photographer, so one of the things, this is just a fun side note, I wanted to take these boats and photograph them all around northern Michigan. So this is in front of our home, and it creates these other pieces, these dreamscapes, these more imaginal pieces. This is not Photoshop, this is the boat over the lake. And then in my photographic work, again, it's that profound awe of living up here. This is outside our home in the morning. That's the moon. So, do you all have do you feel like you understand that the inspiration, the reverence of the land? Do we also have a sense of place? That all the work that we've seen, there's this profound sense of place. So it's an opening up to the land, right? And feeling this dialogue and communication, which I think is an important component. So, one last thing that I want to talk about on the inside view, and that is this concept of courage to create. The courage to create. The artist's courage to create. And the word courage comes from the French word coeur, which means heart. So if we think of all the uses of courage, it's the heart to stand up for what you believe in, right? It's the heart to go into battle for the soldier. It's the heart for an activist to be able to stand up in what they believe in, right? It's the heart. So the artist has the courage to create. They have the heart to be true to that inner voice, to be true to their beliefs, okay? This was absolutely essential with Adam's work. He was both true to his experience through these images, but he was an activist. He profoundly believed in that the American West was, more and more people were moving in, and he really wanted to try to help preserve the land. He had the courage to stand up, to write about it, to be politically active about it. He was on the Sierra board, the Sierra Club board, for 37 years. So there's also the courage to give voice to the awe. For Adams, it was the courage to go out and be out in these landscapes. And again, to be true to his belief, right? To that awe. We've heard, this is God's country. It's giving voice to that belief and not being afraid to give voice to that, right? I think this image really gives voice to that inner awe. So we're going to move to the outside. We're going to talk about that cultural contextualization. And before we talk about the narratives, I just want us to think a minute about how we view artwork. Where do we view it? We typically view art in museums, in galleries, in our home, in books. So if you think about a museum, think about that environment. What is it like? It itself is a place of reverence. It's quiet. You tend to, even if you go with friends, you tend to journey through the galleries on your own. Why is that? It's so that you can have that one-on-one experience. That as you move through and you're engaging with each work of art, whether it's a sculpture or a painting or a photograph, that you can view it. And what you're doing is, as you walk by, you're carrying your story. You're carrying all the experiences of your life. You're not thinking about that, but something will be triggered in a piece of work, and you'll stop, and it will seize you, it'll grab you. It's because the piece that you're looking at is giving voice to a shared story. And so there's that dialogue. You're looking at it, and it draws you in. And so there's this interplay of quiet dialogue, of you and the image working. Susie, come over here. I want you to look at this piece. This is amazing. Susie comes over, and if she doesn't share that life experience with you, she may look at it and go, oh, yeah, yeah. And she may say, well, what do you find so interesting? She's not sharing. But if she shares that same experience, she's going to go, wow. So one of the things we think about is that when you're in our galleries here, they're going to be pretty quiet. You're going to have that personal navigation. Think about that when you're viewing the works. See which pieces really speak to you, which pieces engage you. Open up to that. Because what's going on is you're viewing that piece as authentic. It seems real to you. Doesn't mean that it is realistically created. It means that it is authentically giving voice to a story, to an image story, right? That you feel is authentic or true. So let's move to this concept of cultural narratives, both historic and current, and how they impact our understanding of ourselves and influence cultural and individual behaviors. So I want to talk about three in particular. I want to talk about the Judeo-Christian narratives of the Garden of Eden, and this is briefly, and the Genesis myths of dominion, man's dominion over the earth. I want to talk about the narrative of the Western frontier and about Romanticism. So let's start with the Judeo-Christian narratives and how they have impacted the Western culture's understanding of nature. So nature as Eden. It is a paradise. It is an ideal. And it is the ultimate garden and the place where we wish to return. Then we have, in Genesis 1, we have man's dominion over the earth. How did those narratives impact us? How does that particular narrative impact our understanding of our natural world? Well, if we have dominion over, if it's viewed as humankind has dominion over, then that means we have to take care of it, right? We have to tend to it. It's in our domain. And then, segue culture's years, it becomes a commodity. It's something that's owned. It's ours. Georgia O'Keeffe owned that mountain. This is the American Earth. Adam's book. So we move into this notion of commodification, which really speaks to a current narrative of we are a culture of consumerists, right? We're going to get into that in just a minute. That's a little undernote. But it also impacts, it goes into advertising. Where do we live? Pure Michigan. Right? It's on our plates in case we forget. What's that referencing? That's referencing this ideal of this paradise, right? So these cultural narratives and historic cultural narratives, when we are enmeshed in them, we rarely see them, all right? Because we believe them. We don't need to analyze them. They're part of our system. They're in us. And so in school, they would refer to these narratives as programs running in the background. Just like in your computer, you have a virus program running in your background that only works when it catches something. Well, these are narratives they're influencing our cultural behavior. It's influencing how we interact, how we think about our natural environment. And it profoundly impacted Adams, of course, and us. also that notion of wilderness as virgin. What does that mean? Well, that implies that it's untainted by human touch, right? So wilderness is this place where is uninhabited environment. Okay, Western frontiers. Well, we don't have the frontier now, right? Or we don't think we do. But we know that when this country was founded, the pioneers went across, and what did they do? They wanted to tame it. They wanted to explore it. What did that require? It required courage, the rugged individual, right? So those concepts of courage and the rugged individual, are they part of your psyche? I think so. Because that's part of our American story, that we're these individuals and we've got the courage to go out there and face our new territory space. That's our new frontier, right? So we have the cowboy. If we think about when Ansel Adams was born, who was president? Teddy. Teddy and the Rough Riders, right? So that was the story that was going along. We had the cowboys. Okay, what do we know about cowboys from the films? Those were all coming up with, Ansel Adams was surrounded by this. Those images, those stories, those narratives, the dime novels, these were all impacting him. What do we have with the cowboy? Who's good? He's dressed in white. Who's bad? He's dressed in black, or he's an Injun, right? That's the way it was portrayed. So you've got to realize that those were the stories that was going on when he was filming. See, he was brought up in that Rough Rider. He was, he went out and he was all about climbing those mountains. And so part of that psyche is he valued it. It was important to him. And he said that he very intentionally wanted his work to be out in the world to help preserve what he felt were these beautiful, divine, wouldn't use the word divine, but spiritual, mystical places so that future generations could go there, right? Super important. The notion of protection, to give voice to it and to protect it. So let's talk a minute about Romanticism. And although the Romantic movement was not active when Adams was born, it still had the undernote, the undercurrents that truly influenced him. And those are the aspects that the Romantics' influence. They focused on emotion. They focused on the individual's experience as being an authentic experience. Johnny talked about the sublime landscapes, right? Well, the Romantics believed in the picturesque and the sublime. Well, the sublime, the meaning of sublime then, so we know that our usage of words shifts, right? Over time, our understanding. And so one of the things culturally that's happened with our language is that words that had sacred undertones or associations have turned into secular usage. And so sublime was one of those words. For something to be sublime was to be, it was filled with awe. And awe is there's a terror in awe because you're witnessing it's awesome. You are overwhelmed, and it's overwhelmed with an encounter with the divine, right? It's when you're in a sublime, the sublime landscapes were vast, or there were huge bodies of water, or magnificent lands, but it's that depth, that darkness too, where you feel your humanity and your mortality in the presence of something so grand. Who created this, right? That's the feeling of the romantic sublime. It was very powerful. And so the sublime was moving into those darkness. And so Adam's work absolutely has that note in it. He gives voice to that sublime and that awe, being overwhelmed with emotion. And the beauty so almost, I mean, they would use the word terror, but again, it's a different type of terror because it's a divine kind of, okay? Does that make sense? Yeah? So Adam spoke of his mystical devotions to the world of nature. And the Romantics preferred the wild. Why did they prefer the wild? The wilderness. They preferred it because it allowed them to get back to that emphasis on themselves, to understanding who they were, to their soul. We have Henry Thoreau. We have Walt Whitman, right? Adam said, it's the domain of wilderness that the artist can and will become most functional and expressive. So wilderness was the opposite of a place of culture, of that city life, right? It was a place where things were quiet, where you could go and commune with nature, but also with yourself, to be able to be in reverie, to be in contemplation, to reflect. And maybe this is one of the reasons why Adam's work is important today. Maybe it resonates with us. Maybe it resonates with us because it gives voice to that psychological need to be in that place of contemplation. We live in the city, but we can hold in this being away from commercialism, being away from the advertising, being away from the self-promotion, right? Because his images are contemplative. They quiet us. So we're living like this, in these very hectic worlds, right? He felt very strongly that the wilderness was rapidly becoming one of those aspects of what he referred to as the American dream that was becoming more in the past than the present. So he felt profoundly the need to protect it. Now, one of the things that happened during his time and his involvement with the Sierra Club and these national parks, which, by the way, he didn't like the word park. He really didn't like the word park. Because what do we think of with a park? Groomed, tidy, right? He really wanted the national parks to be called national reserves. Because he wanted them to be places where people could go, but then they'd leave. And one of the things that was happening during his time is that, okay, they've got these huge bodies of land, and we want to make them very accessible, because the government's paying for them. We want to make them accessible. So how do you do that? Roads. Roads, roads, roads. He hated that. And so what do we have with roads? We have a ton of cars, and there is a shift going on. You are no longer out. Some people get out. Some people actually get out and walk. But more and more, people go to the scenic overlooks. And if we don't know where they are, we're reminded anywhere we drive. Scenic overlook ahead. Oh, well, that must be the place where we've got to go. Put down the window. Pull out the cell phone. Right? Or maybe, because we know the scenic outlook, we get out of our car and take our picture. This is referencing, actually, so two things. One, Adams, that bothered him. It bothered him that those roads were going through. It bothered him that people were having these external experiences, right? Remember, it was about here. He wanted people to get out. He wanted people to get into, he wanted people in there. And so that's one of the things he fought for. He tried to, not get the roads in and things like that. But that happened, right? That's how we move. So that speaks to, from his time to our time, one of the stories that's gone on is we have become a culture of observers. And we are passive observers. We sit in our living rooms. We watch nature on PBS. We look on our phones. We look on our iPads. We have become incredibly passive. And so, ironically, I think that's one of the narratives for the reason why his work has done well. Because we are observers. We're a culture of viewers. And I also think that image has become our predominant language. I think we're moving away from word, and I think we are moving into image, both still and moving, as our predominant language. So as a culture of observers in a language of image, his images still speak profoundly. Because we can observe. We do not have to go there, but we still can feel it in our heart, because within his work, his images are touching those deep narrative stories, that romantic notion, the sublime notion, the awe. And if if you believe in that divine encounter with the land, it's speaking to you, and you're going, yeah, and you get his books, and you go, yeah, I feel it, right? Okay. So his work is expressing that romantic, sublime aspect, celebrating the American frontier. It's rugged. Okay. Oh, when was I supposed to go there? Sorry. There you go. Oh, here's why I wanted to go here. We've also moved from that notion of the sublime into a movement of the pleasant. So there's a little bit of a stripping that goes on with that. There's a loss. That if you're profoundly moved to a deep spiritual level, and now when you're out in these parks and they're pleasant experiences, do we see that there's something that's lost? I feel it. And I think his work speaks to that. I think it reconnects us. You know, it's been said that in our culture today, wilderness has moved from out there into the city, right? So the city's the wild place, the untamed place, the scary place. Used to be in the wilds of nature, now it's in here. And with that has come this sense that nature is our true home. I may live in the city, I may live in a house, but nature's my true home. When I get my chance, I get out there. So his images are also giving voice to that authentic place, that place we resonate as our true or real home, I think. So to recap what I've talked about today, I've talked about inspiration, primarily his reverence for the land and how that impacted his photographic process, his intuition, his visualization. So I've talked about his technique, the use of the small aperture to get the full range, and the zone system to then get the range of tone. One is the range of depth of field, everything's in focus. The other is range of tonality. Third, one of the things I didn't talk about, this guy had the most profound sense of PR that I've ever seen. He was crazy motivated. And he was prolific. Really, really prolific. He spent the second half of his life primarily reprinting the images of the first. So how did he get his work out there? Got it out in images. He got it out in books and portfolios. There's a portfolio that goes with all his books. He got it out there by being an activist. He cared, so he lectured. He was politically involved. That's the artist. So why do they have such broad appeal? So there is that archetypal resonance to important cultural narratives, both historic and current. That's what I've been talking about, right? Evoking the romantic sublime, the Western frontier and wilderness, and then this culture of observers. He had heroic status. So we might think of heroes as just being, you think of someone as a soldier or this incredible work of strength, but as a cultural mythologist, there are all types of hero and heroine. And he was a hero because he had the courage to create, the courage to give heart and voice what mattered most to him, the courage to be out into the wilderness, to stand up for what he believed in. And also very important is that his images, the symbolic image of wilderness as our real home. So what we know about symbol, it's not the object itself, but it's what it points to. It points beyond itself, right? So that we bring our story and we can look at this symbol and move beyond what we imagine, right? Okay.